She hit the ground, and no one came. Not the foreman, not the housekeeper, not one single soul from the great house lit up gold on the hill above her. She lay there in the cold and the dark, whispering to a baby who couldn't hear her yet, promising him one thing, that no matter what happened next, they would not take him. A man was driving home from a war he never wanted to fight. But he had no idea what or who was waiting for him. But by sunrise, her secret would no longer be hers alone. This is the story of a girl the world decided didn't matter, and the one man rich enough, powerful enough, and stubborn enough to prove them all wrong.
The night Ivy Hale collapsed in the north pasture, nobody came running. Not the foreman, not the housekeeper, not a single soul from the great house lit up gold on the hill above her. She lay in the cold mud with her hand pressed against her stomach, whispering to a baby who couldn't hear her yet, promising him that no matter what happened, she would not let them take him. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 3 miles away, a man was driving home from the airport after 4 years at sea, about to walk into a war he never signed up for. His name was Grant Ashworth, and by sunrise, her secret would no longer be hers alone. That's where this story begins. But to understand how Ivy ended up alone in that field, we have to go back 6 months, to the day the black truck rolled through the gates of Ashworth Ranch and changed everything. Ivy had been mucking out the third stall since 5 in the morning, the same as every morning for the past 2 years. She was 22, raised in foster homes scattered across 3 counties, and she'd landed at Ashworth Ranch the way a leaf lands on a windshield, by accident, by wind, by nowhere else to go. The ranch hands called her the quiet one. She never argued, never complained, and she had a way with the horses that even old Samuel, the head trainer, admitted he couldn't explain. She could calm a spooked stallion with nothing but a hand on its neck and a voice low as a held breath. What none of them knew was that Ivy couldn't read a single word on the feed labels she sorted every day. She'd memorized the shapes of the letters, the colors of the bags, the way the light hit certain boxes at certain times of day. She had built an entire silent system just to survive in a world that assumed everyone could do the one thing she couldn't. Shame had taught her to hide it well. To understand why Ivy braced herself the way she did every time a stranger looked at her too long, you have to understand where she came from. She had been 6 years old the first time a caseworker packed her belongings into a black trash bag and told her it was time to go to a new family, as if a person's whole life could fit into something meant for garbage. She'd counted, once, in a moment of dark curiosity, exactly how many houses she'd lived in before she turned 18. 11. 11 kitchens where she'd learned not to ask for seconds. 11 bedrooms that were never really hers. Somewhere around the 4th or 5th house, she stopped unpacking her bags all the way, because unpacking meant believing you were staying, and believing you were staying only made the leaving hurt more. She'd never gone to school consistently enough to catch up on reading before the other kids left her behind for good, and by the time anyone might have noticed and helped, she had already built thick, practiced walls around the shame of it. She learned to nod along in conversations. She learned to recognize word shapes instead of sounding out letters. She learned, most of all, to disappear in plain sight, to make herself so quiet and so useful that no one ever looked closely enough to see the parts of her that were still just a scared kid trying to survive a world that hadn't been built with her in mind. The ranch had been the first place that ever felt like it might, eventually, become something more than a stop on the way to somewhere else. Old Samuel had hired her on a hunch after watching her gentle a horse nobody else on the property could get near. He never asked about her past. He simply handed her a pitchfork and told her the east stalls needed mucking, and something about the plainness of that instruction, the fact that it asked nothing of her except honest work, had made Ivy feel, for the first time in years, like she belonged somewhere. She heard the truck before she saw it, the crunch of gravel, the low rumble of an engine too expensive for the dirt road it was driving on. She straightened up, wiped her hands on her jeans, and watched as a man stepped out. He was tall in the way that made doorways look smaller, his jaw shadowed with days of stubble, his eyes the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. This was Grant Ashworth, heir to the ranch, home from the Navy for the first time in 4 years. He didn't look like a man returning to a kingdom. He looked like a man returning to a cage. "You're new," he said, glancing at Ivy like she was a fixture he hadn't noticed before. 2 years, she said. He studied her for a second too long, then nodded and walked past her toward the house, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, shoulders set like a man bracing for impact. Ivy watched him go and felt something she couldn't name. Not attraction exactly, not yet. Recognition. The recognition of one exhausted person spotting another. She had no idea that inside that house, his grandmother Eleanor Ashworth was already waiting at the head of the dining table with a folder of numbers that would decide the fate of everyone on this land, including her. If you're already hooked, go ahead and hit that like button right now, because what happens in the next 10 minutes is going to break your heart before it puts it back together. Now let's get back to it. Eleanor Ashworth did not believe in wasting time on sentiment. The moment Grant sat down across from her, still in his travel clothes, she slid the folder across the table like a queen presenting a decree. The ranch is bleeding money, she said. 60 years my husband and I built this place, and now the bank wants to eat it alive. There is one condition in your grandfather's will that keeps them from taking it. A direct heir bearing the Ashworth name. Not a nephew, not a cousin. Your child, Grant. Grant's jaw tightened. I've been home 4 hours. And you'll be homeless in 4 months if this ranch sells, Eleanor said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. I'm not asking you to fall in love tomorrow. I'm asking you to understand what's at stake. Grant said nothing. He'd spent 4 years learning to survive things he couldn't control, deployments, orders, the deaths of men he'd called brothers. He'd come home hoping for quiet. Instead, he'd walked straight into another battlefield, this one fought with china plates and family portraits instead of gunfire. He thought of the men he'd served with, the way they used to joke about what they'd do the moment they got home. Fishing trips, quiet mornings, ordinary lives free of orders barked from someone above them. None of them had joked about coming home to more orders. None of them had imagined that the war waiting for Grant Ashworth wouldn't be fought with rifles, but with a dining room table, a family crest, and a grandmother who loved him fiercely enough to try to arrange his entire future without asking whether he wanted a say in it. He remembered, too, why he'd left in the first place. He had been 19 when his father died in a hunting accident that everyone whispered wasn't quite an accident, and in the wreckage of that grief, Eleanor had turned the full weight of her expectations onto her only remaining grandson. Every dinner had become a lesson in legacy. Every conversation had circled back, eventually, to duty. Grant had joined the Navy less to serve his country and more to put an ocean between himself and a house that had never once asked him what he wanted, only what he owed. For years later, nothing had changed. The house was the same. The expectations were heavier. And the only difference was that now, there was a deadline attached. A folder of numbers proving that if Grant didn't produce an heir soon, the land his family had bled for across 3 generations would be gone within the year. He didn't know that 2 hallways away, his cousin Marcus Ashworth was already listening at the door, already calculating how this crisis might be turned to his advantage. Marcus had grown up in Grant's shadow, the golden boy who left for the military while Marcus stayed and did the ranch's dirty work, only to be reminded again and again that none of it would ever be his. If Grant failed to produce an heir, if the ranch slipped even an inch toward instability, Marcus intended to be standing there, ready to catch what fell. Downstairs, in the small staff quarters behind the stables, Ivy sat on the edge of her cot with her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, staring at nothing. She was 11 weeks along. The father was a man who'd promised her forever and then vanished the moment she told him, leaving her with nothing but a bus ticket's worth of savings and a stepmother, Delia, who worked in the ranch kitchen and had made it clear from day one that Ivy's existence was a burden she tolerated for the paycheck, not out of love. You can't keep it, Delia had hissed the night Ivy told her, gripping her wrist hard enough to bruise. You have no money, no family, no education. What exactly do you think you're going to give a child except the same nothing you were given? Ivy hadn't answered. She'd only pulled her arm free and walked out into the dark, because some decisions aren't made with words. They're made with the quiet, stubborn refusal to let someone else write your story for you. She didn't know yet that her story and Grant Ashworth's story were about to collide so hard that neither of them would recognize their lives a year from now. 3 days after Grant returned, Eleanor called a family meeting that Ivy had no business attending, except that she'd been asked to bring in fresh coffee, and she happened to be setting the tray down just as Eleanor said the words that would change the direction of the entire story. "If you won't choose a wife from a suitable family, Grant, then perhaps we choose one for you. There are 3 families in this county who would give anything to merge their name with ours." Grant's voice was low iron. "I am not marrying a stranger to save a business deal." "Then you are choosing to lose everything your grandfather built." Ivy set the tray down so carefully that no one noticed her hand shaking. She slipped out of the room, but not before Marcus caught her eye from across the table, a small, calculating smile playing at his mouth. He'd just realized something the others hadn't. This crisis wasn't going to resolve itself in a boardroom. It was going to resolve itself in the cracks of the household nobody was paying attention to. And he intended to watch those cracks very, very closely. That night, Grant couldn't sleep. He walked out to the stables the way he used to as a boy, when the weight of being the heir became too heavy for the house to hold. He found Ivy there instead, brushing down a mare with the kind of tenderness that made him stop in the doorway and simply watch for a moment before she noticed him. "You're good with her," he said. Ivy startled, then nodded. "She doesn't ask me to be anything I'm not." Grant almost smiled. Lucky horse. They talked that night. Not about the ranch, not about heirs or wills or family obligations, but about small things. The way the mare had come to them half-starved 2 winters ago, ribs showing through a coat dull with neglect, and how it had taken Ivy 3 months of patient, wordless mornings before the animal would let anyone but her near its head. The sound the wind made through the north pasture at midnight, low and constant, like the land itself was breathing. Grant told her, almost without meaning to, about a buddy of his named Danny who used to talk about horses every single night on deployment, how he'd promised himself that if he made it home he'd buy a ranch of his own and never leave it. He didn't finish the story. He didn't have to. Ivy understood, in the careful way he let the sentence trail off, that Danny hadn't made it home. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, not reaching for him, just letting the words sit in the space between them. "Yeah," Grant said. "Me too." For the first time since he'd stepped off that plane, Grant felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly, just enough to notice the absence of the tightness that had lived there for years. He hadn't talked about Danny to anyone since the funeral. He hadn't talked about much of anything to anyone since he'd come home, because everyone in that house wanted something from him, and grief wasn't currency they knew how to accept. Ivy hadn't asked him for a single thing all night. She'd simply listened, the way she listened to the horses, patient and unhurried, and somehow that made it easier to say the things he usually swallowed. "Can I ask you something?" Ivy said eventually, running her hand along the mare's neck. "Do you actually want any of this? The ranch? The name? All of it?" Grant considered the question longer than he needed to, because no one had asked him that directly in years. "I used to think I didn't," he admitted. "I used to think the only way to be free of it was to leave and never look back. But standing out here right now, I don't know. Maybe I don't hate the land. Maybe I just hate what it's been used to justify." Ivy nodded slowly, like that answer meant something to her too, something she recognized from her own life, though she didn't say so yet. Neither of them said it out loud, but something had shifted, and somewhere in the house above them, behind a curtain, Delia watched the 2 shapes standing close together in the lantern light of the stable, and her mind began turning in a direction that would soon put Ivy in more danger than she'd ever imagined. Word spread fast in a house full of people with nothing to do but watch each other. Within a week, whispers had reached Eleanor that the stable girl had been seen talking to Grant late at night. Eleanor didn't panic, she strategized. A woman who had spent 60 years protecting a family legacy didn't waste energy on outrage. She simply began asking questions, quietly, the way a hawk circles before it dives. It was Delia who gave her the answers she needed, though not for Eleanor's benefit. Delia had her own plan. If she could convince the family that Ivy was pursuing Grant for money, she could have her fired, removed from the property entirely, before anyone noticed the real reason Ivy had been getting sick every morning for the past 3 weeks. "She's not who you think she is," Delia told Eleanor over tea. Her voice dripped in false concern. "I've heard her on the phone. Money troubles. Desperate money troubles. A girl like that, alone with your grandson every night. You should ask yourself what she's really after." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, not entirely convinced, but curious enough to watch more closely. And that was exactly the crack Marcus had been waiting for. He approached Ivy 2 days later while she was alone in the tack room, leaning against the doorway with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned charm as a weapon. "You know," he said, "my cousin doesn't do relationships. He does duty. Whatever you think is happening between you two, it's not going to end the way you hope." "There's nothing happening," Ivy said evenly, though her pulse had picked up. Marcus smiled, slow and unkind. "Good. Because if there were, I'd hate for you to get hurt when this family decides you're expendable. And trust me, this family always decides that eventually." He left her standing there with his words settling over her like frost. She didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that crying didn't fix anything. She simply pressed her hand to her stomach, the way she did whenever fear rose too high, and reminded herself why she was still standing at all. If this story is pulling you in already, make sure you're subscribed, because the drama is about to get so much more intense, and you will not want to miss a second of what happens next. The fall happened on a Tuesday. Ivy had been carrying a heavy feed bucket up the loft stairs, something she'd done 100 times before, when a wave of dizziness hit her so suddenly that the world tilted sideways before she could catch the railing. She remembered falling. She remembered the sick lurch of her stomach and the white flash of pain in her hip as she hit the ground. And then she remembered nothing at all until she woke up in a hospital bed with fluorescent lights burning overhead and Grant Ashworth sitting in the chair beside her, his elbows on his knees, his face carved from worry. "You're pregnant," he said quietly, before she could even speak. It wasn't an accusation. It was disbelief, softened by something gentler underneath it. Ivy's throat closed. "Please don't tell your grandmother. Please. I'll leave. I'll figure it out. Just don't." "Hey." Grant's voice cut through her panic, low and steady. "Nobody's kicking you out of anywhere. Not while I have a say in it." She stared at him, searching his face for the catch, the condition, the price she'd eventually have to pay for his kindness. She didn't find one. And that, more than anything he could have said, was what finally broke the dam behind her eyes. "I don't even know how to read," she whispered, the confession tumbling out before she could stop it, raw and unguarded in a way she'd never allowed herself to be with another living person. "I've been faking it for years. Memorizing labels. Guessing. I'm terrified someone's going to find out and realize I don't belong anywhere near people like you." Grant didn't flinch. He didn't pity her, which was the thing she feared most. He simply said, "Then we'll fix that. Starting now if you want." It was such a small sentence, but it landed on Ivy like the first real kindness she'd been offered in years, and something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since she was a child bouncing between homes that were never truly hers, began, slowly, to unclench. Outside the hospital room, Eleanor Ashworth stood in the hallway, having heard every word through the door left slightly ajar. She hadn't come to check on a stable girl out of obligation. She'd come because Delia's accusations had planted a seed of suspicion, and Eleanor Ashworth trusted nothing she hadn't verified with her own eyes. What she saw instead of a gold digger was a terrified young woman who had spent years hiding a wound so deep she couldn't even ask for help with it. Eleanor had built an empire by reading people quickly and accurately, and what she read in that hospital room was not deception. It was survival. She didn't say anything to either of them that night, but she made a decision standing in that sterile hallway that would ripple through the rest of the story. She would watch this girl closely, not to destroy her, but to see exactly who she really was. Eleanor drove home alone that night, the hospital lights shrinking in her rearview mirror, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of her own late husband, a man who had married her when her own family had considered her a poor match, too plain-spoken, too stubborn, too unwilling to play the games society expected of a young bride. Everyone had told him he was making a mistake. He'd built an empire instead, with Eleanor standing beside him every step of the way, precisely because she refused to be anyone but exactly who she was. Eleanor had spent so many years since his death guarding the legacy they'd built together that she had almost forgotten the two of them had once been the outsiders everyone doubted. It unsettled her, how much of herself she recognized in a frightened stable girl hiding a secret in a hospital bed. It unsettled her more that she wasn't sure, yet, whether that recognition would be enough to overcome 60 years of carefully guarded caution. Ivy, for her part, didn't sleep much that night either, even after the doctors confirmed both she and the baby were stable and released her with instructions to rest. She lay awake in the narrow bed of her quarters behind the stables, replaying Grant's words over and over. Then we'll fix that, starting now, if you want, turning them over like a stone she couldn't quite believe she'd been allowed to keep. She had spent so many years learning not to trust kindness, because kindness in her experience usually came with strings attached, a price revealed only after you'd already grown to depend on it. She waited for the catch. It didn't come that night. It didn't come the next morning either, when Grant appeared at her door before sunrise with a cup of coffee and an offer to walk her to the barn so she wouldn't have to climb those stairs alone again. Some kindnesses, she was slowly beginning to learn, really were exactly what they appeared to be. The next morning, Grant made a phone call that surprised even himself. He rang an old family friend, a retired literature professor named Arthur Whitmore, who had tutored Grant through a brutal stretch of dyslexia as a child, back when the Ashworth family had been quieter, gentler, before money had hardened everyone around it. "I need a favor," Grant said. Discreet, patient, no judgment. Professor Whitmore arrived 2 days later, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with kind eyes and a voice built for reading aloud. He met Ivy in the ranch library, a room she'd avoided for 2 years because the walls of books felt like a taunt. He didn't make her feel small. He simply opened a children's book, pointed at the first word, and said, "Let's start here. There's no wrong way to learn this. Only your way." For the first time since she was a little girl watching other kids raise their hands eagerly in class, while she sat frozen with panic, Ivy let herself hope that this particular shame might not follow her forever. Weeks passed. The lessons continued in secret, tucked into early mornings before the household woke and late evenings after it slept. Grant found himself lingering in the library doorway more often than he needed to, watching Ivy's face light up every time a sentence finally clicked into place. He told himself he was just checking on his grandmother's investment in the situation. He stopped believing that excuse somewhere around the 3rd week. One evening, as the last of the sunset bled orange through the library windows, Ivy successfully read an entire paragraph aloud without stumbling, a passage about a girl on a horse riding toward a storm because it was the only direction that felt like freedom. When she finished, she looked up to find Grant watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Open, undefended. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she corrected, and for a moment neither of them looked away. It was Grant who finally spoke, his voice rougher than he intended. "I don't know how any of this is supposed to work. The ranch, my grandmother, all of it. But I know I don't want you to disappear when this is over." Ivy's hand drifted, almost involuntarily, to her stomach. "This isn't going to be simple, Grant. People are going to find out. And when they do, I don't think they're going to be kind." "Let them try," he said, and for the first time since he'd come home from the Navy, his voice didn't sound tired. It sounded like a man who had finally found something worth standing his ground for. Neither of them noticed Marcus Ashworth watching from the hallway, arms crossed, mind already spinning toward his next move. Before we go further, if you haven't already, drop a comment telling me who you think is more dangerous, Delia or Marcus. I want to know your theory, because trust me, you have not seen anything yet. The invitation to the Ashworth Founders Gala arrived 3 weeks later, gold script on ivory cardstock, the kind of event that decided reputations in a single evening. Eleanor made it clear that if Grant intended to keep Ivy close, then Ivy would need to be introduced to society properly, dressed, coached, and prepared to stand beside the Ashworth name without embarrassing it. It should have felt like an honor. Instead, it felt to Ivy like walking willingly into a den she knew was full of teeth. Delia used the weeks leading up to the gala to plant poison wherever she could. She whispered to the household staff that Ivy had trapped Grant. She hinted to visiting relatives that the pregnancy had been intentional, strategic, a calculated move by a girl with nothing to lose and everything to gain. And worst of all, she began quietly gathering information, old records, forgotten details from Ivy's file with the foster care agency, hoping to find something, anything, she could use as a weapon when the moment mattered most. Marcus, meanwhile, played a longer game. He befriended a family from a rival ranching dynasty, the Draytons, who had spent a decade trying to buy out Ashworth land and had been blocked at every turn by Eleanor's stubborn refusal to sell. Marcus understood something simple and dangerous. Chaos inside the Ashworth family was an opportunity for the Draytons, and an opportunity for the Draytons was, eventually, an opportunity for him. If the gala goes badly, Marcus told Silas Drayton over expensive scotch in a dim study. If the stable girl embarrasses them publicly, the family's reputation takes a hit right when the bank is deciding whether to extend their loan. You want to weaken the Ashworths. I want Grant to understand exactly how replaceable he is. We want the same outcome. Silas Drayton smiled the smile of a man who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opening. His family had spent 3 generations circling Ashworth land the way vultures circle something not quite dead yet, buying up neighboring parcels, courting county officials, waiting patiently for the day the Ashworths finally stumbled. Eleanor's refusal to sell had always been the one immovable obstacle standing between the Draytons and total control of the valley's water rights, and Silas had learned long ago that immovable obstacles rarely felt a force. They felt a patience, and to men willing to exploit the cracks that families made for themselves. You understand, Silas said, swirling the scotch in his glass, that I don't particularly care what happens to you or your cousin once this is finished. I care about the ranch. Everything else is simply a means to an end. Marcus, arrogant enough to believe he was the exception to every rule that had ever burned someone before him, only smiled back. Then we understand each other perfectly. Neither of them noticed, or cared, that somewhere in that same valley, a young woman who had never asked for any part of this rivalry was about to become the instrument through which both of their ambitions would collide. Ivy, unaware of the storm gathering around her, spent those 3 weeks in a blur of dress fittings and etiquette lessons, of tutoring sessions with Professor Whitmore that stretched later into the night as her reading improved, but her confidence remained fragile. Grant stayed close to her through all of it, not hovering, not smothering, but present in a way that made the ground under her feet feel slightly less unsteady. The etiquette lessons, taught by a stiff but not unkind woman named Mrs. Palmer whom Eleanor had hired from the city, were their own kind of battlefield. Ivy learned which fork belonged to which course, how to greet a senator's wife without stumbling over a title, how to hold a conversation about wine she'd never tasted and horse bloodlines she actually knew better than anyone in the room. She was a quick study. She always had been, when given half a chance, but the speed of her learning didn't erase the ache underneath it, the quiet, persistent fear that no amount of memorized manners would ever be enough to make people like Delia's society friends see her as anything other than a stable girl playing dress-up. One night, halfway through a lesson on formal introductions, Ivy simply stopped, set down the teacup she'd been practicing with, and said, "What's the point? I could learn every rule in that woman's book, and they'll still only see where I started." Mrs. Palmer, who had said very little of a personal nature in 2 weeks of lessons, surprised her by sitting down across from her instead of correcting her posture. "My mother cleaned houses for a family very much like this one," she said. "I spent 30 years learning how to sound like I belonged in rooms my mother was never allowed to sit down in. You know what I learned, dear? The rules were never about proving you belong. They're about giving small-minded people less ammunition to use against you. That's all. The belonging, that part, you already have. Nobody can teach you that. Nobody can take it away either." It wasn't the kind of comfort Ivy expected, but it settled something in her all the same, and she found herself sitting up a little straighter for the rest of the lesson, not because she needed the approval of the ballroom she was about to walk into, but because she was starting, slowly, to believe she'd earned her place in it regardless of what anyone else decided. Grant noticed the shift in her almost immediately. He found her one evening practicing a formal introduction to her own reflection in the library's tall mirror, muttering the words under her breath with a kind of fierce determination that made him lean against the doorframe and simply watch, the way he had that very first night in the stables. "You look like you're preparing for battle," he said. "I am," Ivy answered without turning around. "Just not the kind anyone taught me to fight before." He crossed the room and stood behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror instead of turning her to face him. "For what it's worth," he said, "the version of you standing right here is already more impressive than anyone who's going to be in that ballroom." Ivy allowed herself, finally, to believe him. The night before the gala, Ivy found Grant on the porch, staring out at the pasture under a sky thick with stars. "I'm scared," she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself against the night chill. "Of the gala? Of all of it. Of them finding out what I can't do. Of them looking at me and seeing exactly what your grandmother worried I was." She swallowed hard. Of you realizing they might be right. Grant turned to face her fully, closing the distance between them until there was nothing left to hide behind. I've watched you calm horses that grown men couldn't handle. I've watched you learn to read at 22 with more courage than most people show their whole lives. I've watched you carry a baby alone, in silence, because you didn't trust the world enough to ask for help. You are not what they're afraid of, Ivy. You're what they don't understand yet. It was the first time he'd said her name like that, like it meant something, like it was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking for years. Ivy didn't have words for what rose in her chest. So instead, she simply let him pull her into an embrace that felt less like comfort and more like a promise. Neither of them could have known that promise would be tested within 24 hours, in front of every person who mattered to the Ashworth name. The gala was everything Ivy feared and worse. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and old money, every surface reflecting candlelight off crystal and silk. Ivy walked in on Grant's arm in a dress Eleanor had personally selected, deep green, elegant, deliberately understated so as not to appear as though the family was flaunting a scandal. For the first hour, it almost worked. Ivy smiled where she was supposed to smile, spoke when spoken to, and let Grant's steady presence beside her anchor her through the unfamiliar current of forks and titles and polite, razor-edged conversation. Then Delia made her move. She approached a cluster of the county's most influential women, feigning concern, and loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, said, "It's remarkable, really, how quickly some people learn to fit in, especially when they can't even read the menu in front of them." The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ivy froze, the blood draining from her face as every eye in her vicinity turned toward her, waiting, hungry for humiliation the way certain rooms always are. Someone laughed, a short, cruel bark of a sound. Someone else whispered behind a raised hand. And for one unbearable moment, Ivy felt every insecurity she'd carried since childhood rise up and threatened to swallow her whole. Then Grant stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply set down his glass, stepped in front of Ivy, and let his words cut through the ballroom with the precision of a man who had spent years learning exactly how to hold a room's attention in life-or-death moments far more serious than this one. She couldn't read 6 weeks ago because no one ever gave her the chance to learn, Grant said. She's been teaching herself in secret since she was a child because she was too proud to ask people like you for help. And honestly, looking around this room tonight, I understand exactly why. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Delia's face went white. Grant turned to Ivy, and in front of 200 of the county's wealthiest, most judgmental people, he dropped to one knee. Ivy's hand flew to her mouth. "I wasn't planning on doing this tonight," he said, loud enough for the room but soft enough that it felt, somehow, like it was only for her. "But I'm done waiting for the right moment, because you've taught me that courage doesn't wait for perfect timing. Ivy Hale, I don't care what this family expects, or what this town whispers, or what any of these people think they know about either of us. I want to build a life with you. I want to raise this baby with you. Marry me." The ballroom held its breath. Somewhere near the back, Eleanor Ashworth pressed a hand to her chest, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, tears welled in the old woman's sharp eyes. Ivy, shaking, tears streaking through her carefully applied makeup, whispered, "Yes," and then louder, stronger, like she was reclaiming every year of silence she'd ever been forced into. "Yes." For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath alongside her. 200 people who had come expecting scandal, instead witnessing something none of them would forget for years. A man laying down every ounce of his family's carefully guarded pride for a woman the room had just tried to humiliate. Somewhere near the front, even Mrs. Palmer, who had spent weeks drilling Ivy on the correct way to hold a teacup, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, visibly moved. The applause that followed drowned out Delia's furious retreat from the ballroom. But even as Grant slid a ring onto Ivy's trembling hand, across the room, Marcus Ashworth watched with a cold, calculating stillness, already recalculating his next move. A public proposal didn't dismantle his plans. It only made them more urgent. If that moment gave you chills, smash that like button right now. Because I promise you, the story is far from over, and what happens next will test everything these two just fought for. The engagement should have brought peace. Instead, It brought war, quiet, calculated, and far more dangerous than a whispered insult at a gala. 3 days after the proposal, the county's biggest social event of the season arrived. The annual Founders Cup horse race, a decades-old rivalry between the Ashworth and Drayton ranches that had, over the years, become less about horses and more about pride, land, and legacy. Winning meant more than a trophy. It meant bragging rights that could shift alliances, sway investors, and determine whose name carried more weight at the county bank's next board meeting. The very bank deciding whether to extend the Ashworth's loan. Grant's prize stallion, Titan, had trained for this race all year. And Ivy, whose gift with horses had never truly been given the credit it deserved, had spent countless early mornings working with Titan personally, coaxing out a trust in the animal that even the professional trainers admired. The morning of the race, Ivy noticed something wrong the moment she walked into Titan's stall. The stallion was skittish, sweating, his eyes wide with a panic that hadn't been there the night before. She checked his feed, his water, his legs, and found a small puncture wound near his flank, subtle enough to miss unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. Someone had drugged him. She ran to find Grant, but by the time they returned, Marcus was already standing in the stable doorway, feigning concern, insisting they call the vet and delay their inspection of the evidence, giving whoever had tampered with the horse precious time to erase their tracks. "We don't have time for this," Grant said, kneeling beside Titan, his jaw tight with fury. "Someone did this on purpose. You think someone in our own stable sabotaged our own horse?" Marcus said, feigning offense. "Maybe you should be looking closer to home, cousin. Maybe your fiancé's inexperience is finally showing." Ivy's stomach turned to ice. She recognized, in that instant, exactly what kind of trap was being laid, not just against the horse, but against her. The grandstands were already filling by the time they discovered the puncture wound, families from every corner of the county settling into their seats with programs and binoculars, unaware that half a mile away, in a stable that smelled of hay and antiseptic, a much more consequential drama was unfolding. Grant wanted to scratch Titan from the race entirely, but the ranch's foreman pulled him aside with a grim reminder of exactly how much was riding on today beyond pride. A representative from the county bank was seated in the stands at this very moment, watching the race as a kind of informal referendum on whether the Ashworth name still carried the strength it once had. A forfeit wouldn't just cost them a trophy. It would hand the bank exactly the excuse it needed to call in the loan early. Despite the chaos, they entered Titan in the race anyway, unwilling to forfeit and hand the Draytons an easy victory. Ivy rode alongside the trainers in the paddock, watching with her heart in her throat as Titan, still shaky from whatever had been in his system, thundered around the final turn neck and neck with the Drayton's horse. It was Ivy's voice, calling out across the fence in the same low, steady tone she'd used to calm him 100 times before, that settled the stallion enough to surge ahead in the final stretch and cross the finish line first. The Ashworths won, but the victory was hollow, because everyone in that stable knew someone had tried to make sure they lost, and whoever it was hadn't finished trying. That night, an anonymous tip arrived at the county sheriff's office, accusing Ivy of drugging her own family's horse to manufacture sympathy and secure her place in the Ashworth family. The tip included a fabricated receipt for a veterinary sedative, supposedly purchased under Ivy's name. Ivy was brought in for questioning the next morning, and though Grant stood by her through every excruciating minute of it, the damage to the family's public image had already begun to spread through the county like wildfire. Ivy, sitting in a cold interrogation room with her hands folded over her stomach, felt the walls of her hard-won new life closing in again. "I didn't do this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear behind it. "I would never hurt that horse. I would never hurt anyone." The detective, a weathered woman named Officer Reyes who had grown up in the county and knew exactly how these ranching families operated behind closed doors, studied Ivy for a long moment before setting down her notepad. "I believe you," she said quietly, "which means somebody wanted us to believe the opposite. And that tells me this isn't about a horse race at all." It took 4 days of investigation, security footage, and one very nervous stable hand who finally cracked under Officer Reyes's patient questioning to reveal the truth. The young hand, a 19-year-old named Cole who had only taken the job that spring, broke down in tears halfway through his second interview. explaining that Marcus had offered him 3 months' wages in cash to slip a sedative into Titan's feed and to keep quiet about who'd asked. He hadn't known, he insisted, that anyone would try to pin the blame on Ivy. He'd assumed, naively, that it was simply a prank meant to embarrass Grant before the race. Officer Reyes, who had interviewed enough frightened young men over the years to know the difference between a liar and a boy in over his head, believed him, and used his testimony to pull the thread that unraveled the rest of it. Marcus had paid the young hand to drug Titan and plant the fabricated receipt, working in coordination with Silas Drayton, whose fingerprints turned up on a burner phone used to send the anonymous tip. The revelation shattered what remained of the family's fragile unity. Eleanor, standing in her study as Officer Reyes laid out the evidence, looked older in that moment than Ivy had ever seen her, not from the scandal, but from the devastating realization of exactly how far her own grandnephew had been willing to go. "Get him off my property," Eleanor said, her voice cracking only slightly. "Tonight." But Marcus didn't leave quietly. That night's sudden crackdown pushed him into a corner, and cornered men, as Officer Reyes would later say, make the most dangerous mistakes. Desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of his plan, Marcus made one final, reckless move. He approached Ivy alone near the stables under the pretense of apologizing, and when she refused to hear him out, he grabbed her arm and forced her into a waiting truck, driving off into the night before anyone realized what had happened. Comment below right now if you saw that coming. And if you didn't, buckle up, because the next few minutes are the most intense of the entire story. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. Grant discovered Ivy missing less than 20 minutes later, when Professor Whitmore, arriving for their evening reading lesson, found the library empty and a single dropped hair clip glinting on the stable floor near a set of fresh tire tracks that shouldn't have been there. What followed was the longest night of Grant Ashworth's life. He called Officer Reyes immediately, his voice raw with a fear he hadn't felt since the worst nights of his deployment overseas. Search efforts mobilized within the hour, ranch hands on horseback fanning out across the property, county deputies checking every road leading out of town, Eleanor working the phones with a ferocity that reminded everyone exactly why she had kept this family's empire standing for 6 decades. Inside the truck, Ivy fought against the restraints Marcus had used to bind her wrists, her mind racing not with fear for herself, but with fear for the baby she could feel shifting uneasily inside her. "You don't have to do this," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite her racing heart. "Whatever you think this accomplishes, it won't work. Grant will never stop looking for me." "That's exactly the point," Marcus snapped, gripping the wheel with white knuckles as he sped down a back road toward an abandoned property near the county line. "He needs to understand what it feels like to lose everything the way I have. Every single time." "You didn't lose everything," Ivy said quietly. "You gave it away. Every choice you made. The sabotage, the lies, that was you. Not Grant. Not me." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing because some part of him, buried under years of resentment, recognized the truth in her words even as he refused to accept it. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the truck's headlights cutting twin tunnels through the dark countryside, as Marcus took turn after turn Ivy didn't recognize, putting distance between them and anyone who might come looking. She kept talking, not because she thought reasoning with him would work, but because as long as she was talking, she was thinking, and as long as she was thinking, she wasn't giving in to the panic clawing at the edges of her control. "You said you wanted him to lose everything," she said, watching Marcus's white-knuckled grip on the wheel. "But you're the one who's going to lose everything now. A kidnapping charge doesn't go away, Marcus. There's no version of tonight where this ends with you getting anything you actually wanted." "Shut up," he snapped, but his voice cracked slightly on the second word, and Ivy heard it, the first thread of doubt in a plan that had clearly been built more out of desperation than strategy. The truck eventually broke down on a stretch of gravel road half a mile from the old Drayton grain silo, a stall that would prove to be Marcus's undoing, because the moment the engine sputtered out, Ivy saw her chance. She'd spent 2 years learning every trick a stable full of half-wild horses could teach a person about patience, timing, and the split-second decision to act. She kicked the passenger door open the instant Marcus climbed out to check the engine, and ran. She ran through unfamiliar fields in the dark, her heart hammering, her breath tearing at her throat, one hand cradling her stomach the entire way, until the headlights of search vehicles finally swept across the horizon and she screamed until someone heard her. Grant reached her first. He fell to his knees in the wet grass and pulled her into his arms so tightly it was as if he was trying to physically keep the universe from ever threatening to take her again. "I've got you," he said, over and over, his voice breaking in a way she had never heard from him before. "I've got you. You're safe. You're safe." Marcus was arrested less than an hour later, found wandering the county road, and the charges that followed, kidnapping, sabotage, fraud, ensured he wouldn't be a threat to the Ashworth family again for a very long time. But the night's terror had taken its toll. As the adrenaline of the rescue faded, Ivy doubled over in sudden, sharp pain, and Grant realized with sickening clarity that the stress of the abduction had sent her into early labor. They didn't even make it to the main hospital in time. Officer Reyes drove them herself, lights flashing, while Grant knelt in the back seat holding Ivy's hand, whispering every reassurance he could think of as she gritted her teeth through contractions that were coming far too fast, far too close together. They reached the small county clinic just in time. The next 40 minutes blurred into a chaos of fluorescent lights, urgent voices, and Grant's hand gripped so tightly in Ivy's that neither of them could later remember which of them had been holding on for support and which had simply refused to let go. And then, cutting through all of it, a sound that stopped the entire room. A thin, furious, healthy cry. "It's a boy," the nurse said, and placed a small, red-faced, impossibly perfect baby onto Ivy's chest. Ivy stared down at her son, tiny fingers curling instinctively around her thumb, his cry already softening into the low, contented murmur of a newborn finally at rest against his mother's chest. She counted his fingers without meaning to, the way she'd read once that new mothers did, and found herself laughing through her tears at the sheer ordinary miracle of 10 fingers, 10 toes, a heartbeat she could feel fluttering against her own. Every fear she had carried in silence for months. The fear that she wasn't enough, that she'd bring a child into a world with nothing to offer him, that she'd fail him the way the world had so often failed her, dissolved in an instant, replaced by something fiercer and steadier than fear had ever been. Tears streaming freely now, all the fear of the last 6 months collapsing into something that finally felt like relief. Grant pressed his forehead to hers, his own eyes wet in a way he made no effort to hide. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For every second you had to be afraid. For every day this family made you feel like you didn't belong. I promise you, starting right now, that's over." Ivy looked up at him, exhausted, radiant, unbroken despite everything that had tried to break her. "We did this," she said, echoing the words from the library all those weeks ago. "Together. If you're not crying right now, I don't know what to tell you. But before we finish this story, make sure you've liked this video, because the ending is going to hit even harder than this moment did." The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow exhale after months of held breath. Eleanor Ashworth, humbled by everything the investigation had revealed about her own blindness to Marcus's resentment, made a decision that surprised the entire county. She stepped back from daily control of the ranch and, in a private ceremony witnessed only by family, formally welcomed Ivy into the Ashworth name, not as a political necessity, but as the woman who had shown more courage, honesty, and quiet strength than anyone else in this family had managed in a generation. Delia, whose role in spreading rumors and gathering ammunition against Ivy had come to light during the investigation, was quietly dismissed from the household. She packed her things in a single afternoon, refusing to meet anyone's eyes on her way out, and the last thing she said to Ivy, hissed low enough that only the two of them could hear it, was that she'd only ever wanted to protect her from a world that would eventually chew her up and spit her out anyway. "Maybe you did," Ivy said, surprising herself with how calm her voice sounded. "But you protected me the way you protect a fire, by starving it. I didn't need less. I needed someone to believe I could handle more." Delia had no answer for that. She left without an apology, though Ivy found, to her own surprise, that she no longer needed one. She had spent her whole life waiting for people like Delia to validate her worth. She didn't need that anymore. She had built her own. Professor Whitmore continued his lessons long after Ivy no longer needed the help, because by then their sessions had become something closer to friendship than tutoring. and Ivy, in a quiet moment of full-circle grace, began volunteering to read to children at the local shelter on weekends, the very same kind of shelter that had once passed her from home to home without anyone stopping to ask if she was okay. Grant, for his part, spent every spare hour he had rebuilding not just a ranch, but a home, a real one, filled with the kind of steady, ordinary love neither of them had grown up believing they deserved. He taught Ivy to ride competitively, something she'd never had the confidence to try. She taught him, in turn, that healing wasn't a weakness, that a man could survive war and still come home soft enough to hold a newborn like he was made for nothing else. 6 months after their son, whom they named Wesley, was born, Grant and Ivy were married on the same ranch where she'd once mucked out stalls before dawn, too ashamed to admit she couldn't read the labels on the feed bags stacked beside her. The ceremony was small, held beneath the same stars that had witnessed their first honest conversation in the stables all those months ago. Eleanor stood beside them, finally at peace with a legacy secured not through obligation, but through love freely chosen. There was no ballroom this time, no towering floral arrangements or engraved invitations sent to 200 strangers. Ivy had asked for exactly the opposite of the gala that had once tried to break her: string lights instead of chandeliers, hay bales instead of gilded chairs, and a guest list made up only of people who had actually earned a place in her life. Old Samuel walked her down the aisle, gruff and teary in a way none of the ranch hands had ever seen him before, muttering under his breath the entire way that he'd known there was something special about her from the first week she'd shown up asking for extra work instead of extra pay. Officer Reyes came, off duty for the evening, and Professor Whitmore read a short passage aloud during the ceremony. Not because Ivy needed his help anymore, but because she'd asked him to, as a quiet tribute to the man who had handed her the first key to a door she'd spent her whole life standing outside of. Delia was not invited, and no one, not even Eleanor, suggested otherwise. As the sun set over Ashworth Ranch that evening, Ivy stood at the porch railing with Wesley asleep against her shoulder, watching Grant walk toward her across the field he'd grown up dreaming of escaping and had instead learned, because of her, to love again. She thought of the girl who had once collapsed alone in a cold pasture, terrified and unseen. She thought of every year she'd spent hiding, apologizing for taking up space, believing that where she came from determined what she deserved. She thought of the 11 houses that had never been home, and the one that finally, against every likelihood, had become exactly that. She had been wrong. Not because the world had suddenly become kind, but because she had refused, again and again, to let it convince her she was small. In the years that followed, the story of the stable girl who married the Ashworth heir would be told and retold throughout the county, each version a little more polished, a little more legend than fact. But the version that mattered most was never the one whispered at dinner parties or printed in the society pages. It was the one Ivy told Wesley herself, years later, tucking him into bed on nights when the wind moved through the north pasture the same way it always had. A story about a girl who was told, over and over, that she didn't belong, and who decided, over and over, to belong anyway. "Ready?" Grant asked, stepping up beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist as their son stirred softly between them. Ivy looked out at the ranch. Her ranch now, built not on inheritance, but on everything she had survived to earn it. "Yeah," she said, smiling for the first time without a trace of fear behind it. "I'm ready." As the sun set over Ashworth Ranch that evening, Ivy stood at the porch railing with Wesley asleep against her shoulder, watching Grant walk toward her across the field he'd grown up dreaming of escaping and had instead learned, because of her, to love again. She thought of the girl who had once collapsed alone in a cold pasture, terrified and unseen. She thought of every year she'd spent hiding, apologizing for taking up space, believing that where she came from determined what she deserved. She had been wrong. Not because the world had suddenly become kind, but because she had refused, again and again, to let it convince her she was small. "Ready?" Grant asked, stepping up beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist as their son stirred softly between them. Ivy looked out at the ranch. Her ranch now, built not on inheritance, but on everything she had survived to earn it. "Yeah," she said, smiling for the first time without a trace of fear behind it. "I'm ready. And if this story taught you anything today, let it be this. Where you start doesn't decide who you become. If you love this journey as much as I loved bringing it to you, make sure you're subscribed for more stories just like it. Drop a comment telling me your favorite moment, and I'll see you in the next one.